So before we get into the five-part test, I guess it makes sense to look at what a homelessness application is before we kind of get that far. And in one sense, homeless application or homelessness application is just the kind of the fancy term for when someone applies for help to a housing authority. So a housing authority in this sense is basically your local council or a local council which has a housing department in it. Now it's a bit complicated because some areas have got unitary authority, so everything's all under one roof, and other areas have got this kind of two-tier system where you've got a county council and then a district council. And generally speaking, in my experience, housing will be in the district council. So essentially, a homeless application is simply when someone who might be homeless approaches a council for help with their housing, asks them for help with their housing, and gives them reason to believe that they might be homeless. So it's a really low threshold. And one of the first myths that people tend to encounter is this idea where someone does this, they go to the council, often into the customer service centre, and they say, you know, look, I'm homeless, or I'm threatened with homelessness, or I'm experiencing abuse, and you know, I need your help. Can you help me out, please? And that's kind of how it kind of tends to be. And often what happens is that councils will say, or council officers will say, you know, I'm really sorry, we're really busy at the moment. You know, if you come back in 3 weeks' time, you know, you can make a homeless application then. And this kind of, you know, understanding is completely missing the point of the way the Housing Act should work. And so in this video, I'm going to look at two sections of the Housing Act. They're probably they're arguably the two most important sections. So Section 184 and then Section 188. And Section 184 is the most important part of the Housing Act in terms of homelessness. And it essentially kind of, you know, it becomes the kind of the fulcrum that everything else kind of is built upon. And essentially what the Housing Act says in Section 184 is if a homeless applicant, so a homeless applicant is simply someone who has approached the council and applied for assistance in any particular form. It doesn't need to be a particular form, it doesn't need to be said in a particular way. They're just applying for assistance under the Housing Act, and they give the council reason to believe that they might be homeless. Section 184 happens at that point, not in 3 weeks' time when the council finally get around to actually looking at the case. It happens there and then. And the next thing to understand, and this is kind of outlined in Chapter 18 of the Homelessness Code of Guidance, which you can just Google. It's the first thing that comes up. You'll get the most recent version. But Chapter 18 is all about homeless applications and the decision-making process. And the Code of Guidance clearly lays out the fact that homeless applications can be made in any particular form. So as I say, it doesn't need to be the person asking for assistance under Part 7 of the Housing Act, Section 184. They simply just need to ask the council for help in some way. And the next thing that Code of Guidance says, it can be made to any department of the housing authority. So, you know, in one sense, you know, even if you're just kind of asking housing benefit, or you just kind of, even if you're speaking to a counsellor in like a local advice surgery, because the counsellor is in effect an employee or part of the housing authority, you know, if you've asked that counsellor for help, or that staff member for help, and given the reason to believe you might be homeless, Section 184 happens there and then. And basically from that point, the council is under a duty to look into that person's circumstances or that family's circumstances to work out whether they owe another duty to that person or family. So that's kind of how it should work. As I say, it could be made to any department of the local authority. And also, you know, the Code of Guidance gives a specific example where people apply to the housing register, and in applying to the housing register, they give the council reason to believe they might be homeless. So if in that application process to the housing register, you say that, you know, you've already been evicted, or you're about to be evicted, or you say you're subject to abuse, or you say you can't afford your rent, all of those things would give the council reason to believe you might be homeless. So obviously that's the kind of the technicalities of homelessness, which we cover in the next video. But essentially what I just kind of want to make clear before we get that far is that, you know, this duty is a very low threshold to cross. You know, it's just those two elements: ask for help, give the council reason to believe you might be homeless. So that's kind of Section 184. Section 188 will follow Section 184 fairly closely. So if you're a homeless applicant, so someone has asked the council for assistance and given them reason to believe they might be homeless, the council's next job is to work out, do they owe a duty of providing temporary accommodation to that household or that person. So, and in one sense, to work that out, they've got 3 questions to ask. Is there reason to believe the person might be homeless, which we've kind of already, that already been crossed? Is there reason to believe they might be eligible for assistance, which again, I'm going to do a separate video on, but that's largely speaking, do they have recourse to public funds? And is there reason to believe they might be in priority need? So, and that kind of wording is absolutely important, that you're really pedantic about it, because time and again I see housing officers just kind of have this mishmash of like wording when they're actually or kind of receiving these applications. They'll kind of say, well, I don't have reason to believe you are in priority need. It's like, well, that's not the test. The test is there reason to believe you might be? It doesn't matter whether you kind of actually ascertain whether they are or not yet. You are just simply looking at whether it's possible that this person might be homeless or might be in priority need. So if a woman walks into the council's housing option service and says, I'm homeless and I'm pregnant and I'm eligible for assistance, let's kind of keep it simple, because she said she's pregnant, the council has got reason to believe she might be pregnant. There's nothing more to it than that. Now, if some really weird and wacky example where you've got a woman who every week is going in and every week she gets found that she's got a pillow up her jumper and she's saying she's pregnant, she turns out not to be, that would be a situation where you could legitimately say, do you know what, we haven't actually got reason to believe you might be pregnant here because of the situation we've had with you before. But for everyone else, and let's face it, most people are honest people, and I think I just want to underline that fact. There is this default position among councils to disbelieve everything, and a housing officers kind of act on this basis that everyone is trying it on. In reality, very, very few people try it on. In my experience, I've had a handful of people try it on, and interestingly, the 3 people who I can think of off the top of my head all owned property. They're all homeowners rather than being, desperate for actual assistance. So they all had resources, and they kind of would say things like, "Oh, what do I need to say to get housed?" And I'm like, it's not like that. You just need to say the truth, and if there's a duty, they'll help you out. So that's kind of one of the things to understand how low this duty is to act under Section 188. And as I say, just to kind of highlight a few other things as well, which we'll kind of come back to as well. Local connection is not mentioned at this point. So, when councils say, oh, we've got no duty to you because you have no local connection, well, actually, you do have a duty to them under Section 184, and you will potentially have a duty under Section 188 if there's reasons to believe they might be homeless, might be eligible, and might be in priority need. So that's kind of, a number of things to say there. I'll probably say one more thing about homeless applications at this point, and that is that under the Homelessness Reduction Act, which was like an additional bit of law that came in a few years ago, there is this new duty for certain organisations to refer people to the housing authority if they think they might be homeless. So police, probation, youth offending, prisons, some NHS kind of bodies would have a duty to refer people who they think might be homeless. Now, if you go back to that 2-part thing for a homeless application to actually be triggered, that duty to refer for will give the council reason to believe they might be homeless, but it wouldn't necessarily actually say that that person wants help from the council. So it doesn't actually trigger a homelessness application. So in one sense, what we tell people who are in those kind of professions is do the duty to refer form, just get it out of the way, and then send a follow-up email which basically says, subsequent to to the duty to refer I sent, I just want to clarify this person wants your help in finding housing. And at that point, the council's now got reason to believe the person might be homeless and they've asked for assistance. Therefore, Section 184 has happened. Now, once they've completed their inquiries, they have to reach a decision which has to be given in writing. And this is really key because we work with lots of people who say, I've been to the council. So I went to the council, I told them about my situation, and they said that I probably wasn't in priority need, so there's nothing they could do, and it wasn't worth me making a homeless application. Now, that's kind of classic gatekeeping stuff because in our experience, most people are owed a duty, and most people who approach homelessness services will be in priority need. If they weren't in priority need, they wouldn't need homelessness assistance, they wouldn't need those services assistance. And so, it's not the exact same thing as being in priority need, but if you've got care and support needs, if you've got needs for support from homelessness services, you may well be in priority need. And yet what we see again and again is people who do turn out to be in priority need being told that there's no reason to even think they might be in priority need, which is kind of, that's kind of really damning evidence, which, no matter how many times we kind of show that actually someone is in priority need, councils still kind of carry on as if they've done nothing wrong. That's maybe one of the biggest problems, is where councils, you get them to accept that the homeless application's been triggered, and then they'll say, well, we've got no reason to even think this person might be in priority need, which is crazy. Even low, even kind of so-called simple mental health issues like depression, anxiety, could make someone in priority need. It is really a question of working out how is that particular individual affected by their particular mental health issues in their particular situation. So you cannot have a blanket approach to say to people, well, depression can't make you in priority need. That is gatekeeping. That is simply a blanket approach, and you should challenge it if you're a professional, because what happens is people who are really, really vulnerable because of depression, risk of suicide and so on, are getting told that they're not in priority need. There's nothing the council can do. It's just a barefaced lie. So you need to challenge that stuff. I'm trying to think if there's anything else you need to know about homeless applications. I can't think of anything at this point, but if I do kind of think of anything else, I'll include it in the subsequent videos. But as I say, that is what homeless applications are and how they should work. It's crazy to talk in terms of having to make a council follow the law, but that is the reality. That if you're a professional who wants to get people housed, that is quite often what you have to do. So you have kind of common myths around, oh, the person needs to approach in person to make a homeless application. That's not true. Code of guidance says that applications can be made in any particular form, and so therefore the sensible way of doing it is to do it via email. So literally, if I was working with someone, I'd talk through what it all entailed, I'd get some basic details, I'd get their consent, and I'd send an email off saying, Joe Bloggs tells me he's homeless, he tells me he's suffering with anxiety, depression, PTSD, and he tells me that he's in receipt of benefits, therefore he's likely to be eligible for assistance, and he wants your help. You've just triggered a homeless application. And the code of guidance is also clear, and case law is clear, that it's not for applicants to prove their case. It is council's job to make the inquiry. So if a woman walks into a customer service centre and says, I'm homeless and I'm pregnant, it's the council's job to make inquiries of the midwife, the GP, whoever, to confirm whether she is pregnant or not. Now that doesn't mean to say that you should be sort of obstructive. If you've got evidence on hand, to back it up, then by all means provide it. But sometimes there will be good reasons why you do not have, proof of important things. So, for example, if you're fleeing abuse, you may not have any ID, you may not have any kind of your green book or your medical records or anything. And councils, therefore, that it's on them to make inquiries. And again, what we see often is, people will get told, well, you need to go and get a letter from your GP that explains that you're in priority need. And it's like, well, most GP surgeries, if a patient went to ask for that, they'd be charging 50 or 60 quid for it, and they don't have 50 or 60 quid. So it's kind of just a really cynical way that councils try and get rid of people. And I guess there's a few other things that come in with that as well. There's a great example we've seen in Bedford where a woman walks into a council, she's pregnant, she's fleeing domestic abuse. Housing officer says, essentially what she was saying is, I don't believe you're pregnant, even though she was visibly pregnant. So she says, here's a pregnancy test. I want you to go and take that pregnancy test. And, the woman goes and does it. Test is positive. So the housing officer says, no, this isn't enough, actually. I need you to go and get your green book, from your midwife. So she goes and gets the green book from the midwife. And then the housing officer says, no, this isn't enough. I need you to see a scan photo. And it's utterly sickening and crazy. It should never, ever happen. Because in one sense, it's not like they're trying to convict you of being pregnant or anything. It's not like this kind of beyond all reasonable doubt threshold. The initial threshold is so low, it's unbelievable. Reason to believe you might be in priority need. Well, as I say, pregnancy is a nice, easy one. You would be in priority need if you are pregnant. And if you say you're pregnant, that gives the council reason to believe you might be. And it is that simple. So, if what we say to kind of professionals supporting people in this kind of situation is, if you can make sure councils do this bit right, a lot of other stuff down the line will become much easier. But I've got a lot of experience with this kind of stuff. If I went to a councillor who didn't know me at all, I can guarantee that I would be coming up against exactly these myths. And I've had councillors, even when you're kind of saying, here's the code of guidance, it says here you must do this, and they still won't do it. So, don't get disheartened. If you want to get homelessness sorted out in your local area, it's probably going to require several years of consistent effort, complaining, raising issues with councillors, whatever, and saying, actually, there is a problem here of vulnerable people being left homeless because of gatekeeping, and it needs to change. And it does take that long to kind of to get people's attention and get councils actually reconsidering their approach. So as I say, don't get disheartened if you walk into a customer service centre and you get told, oh, the person's got no ID, so they can't possibly make a homeless application, and until they've got ID, then we can't do anything. It's nonsense. There's nothing in the law that says you need ID. At that first stage, you're basically looking to whisk that person away from any risk and place them in safe accommodation. And all the inquiry stuff comes later. It is a criminal offence to knowingly mislead a council in order to get housed, but you don't. What that doesn't mean is you don't assume everyone's lying to get housed. It's just not backed up by the evidence. And again, it's not like a new thing. There's an interesting book by Clement Attlee, which is written 100 years ago, which talks about this kind of ingrained suspicion in bureaucratic systems. And unfortunately, it's still the same today. But we can challenge it, and we should challenge it. So that's homeless applications and a little bit about temporary accommodation. Next up will be the actual definition of homelessness, and we'll kind of build it up from there. There are lots of other videos I've done on YouTube, so do check it out. Things like, a bit more about Section 188, when Section 188 ends. There's things about, what temporary accommodation actually is and what kind of different ways temporary accommodation can be provided, all that kind of stuff. But this is really kind of the basic framework that you need to know in order to get people housed.